Imagine a civilization built on a chilling secret. We celebrate the Caesars, the legions, and the soaring architecture. But what if the true foundation of Roman power wasn't marble or gold, but the silent screams of the innocent? For every triumphant arch raised in Rome, countless lives were meticulously disassembled and crushed. The empire's relentless advance across Europe, Africa, and Asia did more than just claim territory. It demanded a tribute of human beings, reaching out specifically for the most vulnerable, young girls. Their seizure, sale, and subsequent enslavement weren't an unfortunate side effect of war. They were the essential, agonizing fuel of Rome's sophisticated machine. Their story is the shadow history of one of the world's most lauded empires. Before we dive deeper into the harrowing reality of these forgotten children, please make sure to subscribe to help us keep uncovering history's most difficult truths. And while you're here, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Throughout the dramatic rise of the Roman Republic and the subsequent imperial age, the calculated capture of entire enemy populations was a strategic aim, not a mere consequence. From the damp forests of Gaul to the deserts of Judea, from the coasts of Britannia to the lush fields of Asia Minor, Roman commanders executed a brutal, standardized procedure. As the heavy infantry marched out, plunder and human captives were secured. Among this living cargo were girls, frequently caught between the ages of 10 and 15, whose youthful existence was annihilated in a single brutal moment. Under Roman legal doctrine, these girls were instantly reduced to praeta or spoils. They became chattel, property of the state or the conquering general, the instant they were seized. The military leadership not only allowed this systematic enslavement of civilians but also often prioritized it for economic gain. Following the surrender of a settlement, officers would categorize the people by sex, health, and age. Preteen and adolescent girls were considered highly valuable commodities, easy to manipulate and offering decades of potential service. They were routinely stripped of their cultural clothing, subjected to invasive physical examinations, and sometimes branded with ownership marks indicating who owned them or their origin. The ancient sources leave behind disturbing documentation of this savagery. The historian Plutarch, writing about the campaign of Lucullus in Pontus, described a glut of captives so massive that the price of slaves crashed completely. Tacitus documented the aftermath of the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, detailing how numerous Jewish girls were forced to walk in chains during the celebrated triumph of General Titus, only to disappear into indefinite servitude. The psychological impact on these children was catastrophic and immediate. Ripped away from their remaining family, many of whom were already dead or enslaved, they faced a complete obliteration of their prior self. Roman jurisdiction offered a slave no recognition as a person. These captured youths had zero legal defense, no way to appeal their situation, and no future beyond the directives of their masters. Their birth names were commonly changed to Latin ones or substituted altogether. Their native tongue was aggressively suppressed, and any lingering spiritual or religious practices were strictly forbidden. Some were forced to march hundreds of miles across provinces to reach the Italian peninsula. Others were held in temporary detention camps before being sold off. Regardless, all were destined for a marketplace that appraised them solely as valuable objects, young, resilient bodies capable of providing labor, entertainment, or fertility. Their ordeal had barely started. Forget the dignified image of the Forum as a hub of democracy. Picture it instead as a congested center of human commerce, where the loud bartering of merchants drowned out the despair of the unwilling. This was the notorious Roman slave market, a grim setting where, for countless girls, the life of utter servitude began. These venalitia, or slave markets, dotted the entire Roman world, with the most infamous sales taking place right beside the Capitol, near the Forum Boarium. Here, girls captured in military victories or born into bondage were sold like inanimate goods. Buyers arrived early, meticulously evaluating the rows of adolescents, many still children. Their monetary worth was determined by age, physical robustness, and perceived docility. Youth, especially, demanded a premium price due to their potential for long-term endurance, beauty, and years of reproductive capacity or domestic work. Once they reached the auction site, the girls were forced onto a raised wooden platform, the catasta, for public inspection. Roman customs explicitly authorized sellers to strip the enslaved to confirm their physical condition. The statesman Cicero famously wrote of slaves being placed on the stand and displayed like merchandise. For these young girls, this meant enduring intimate and objectifying examination by potential buyers, who scrutinized their teeth, checked their skin for lesions, and assessed their posture, all while shouting questions the children likely couldn't comprehend. Many wore small signs around their necks, tituli, listing their origin, approximate age, and any supposed flaws, such as a perceived attitude, language barriers, or prior sickness. These signs were often misleading. Sellers had a financial incentive to hide prior trauma or acts of resistance. Since most were sold very young, many could not even articulate their own histories, if they could recall them at all. While the entire Roman economy ran on slave labor, the demand for young female slaves was uniquely specialized. They were not exclusively purchased for heavy manual tasks. Within the vast homes of the wealthy, their roles included maids, nurses for infants, or personal attendants, duties that often led to the most vulnerable forms of private exploitation. Behind every finalized transaction lay the absolute abolition of self-determination. Once paid for, a girl legally belonged to her dominus, her master, backed by Roman law, social tradition, and physical force. The exchange of currency and ink sealed her destiny. Some were resold multiple times across their lifetime, treated as disposable property, each sale further eroding their identity and memories of home. There was no formal ceremony, no chance for a final goodbye, only a harsh order, the coldness of a metal chain, and the indifferent gaze of a new owner. The Roman slave market didn't just deal in human bodies. It devoured entire futures, muted countless voices, and entrenched a system where even childhood offered no defense against institutionalized exploitation. In these brutal arenas, the celebrated power of Roman civilization stood not on pillars of justice, but on the systematic commodification of the powerless. Tucked away behind the magnificent courtyards and smooth marble columns of the Roman aristocracy, a different, quieter narrative unfolded, one defined by ceaseless submission, unending drudgery, and unspoken agony. For numerous young female slaves, their journey after the auction block began inside these lavish domus, houses, where they lived not as residents, but as mere assets. Referred to in Latin as ancillae, these girls were assigned domestic duties that ranged from the simple and menial to the profoundly personal. The instant they crossed the threshold, their existence became wholly dictated by the capricious demands of the mistress and master. Commands consumed every waking minute. Sweep the receiving hall, tend to the heating fires, fetch drinking water, serve the daily meals, carefully braid the mistress's hair, and look after the children. The households of the Roman elite were complex, tightly structured institutions. The paterfamilias, the patriarchal head, possessed virtually limitless authority. Even among the enslaved, a harsh hierarchy existed. Young girls were usually relegated to the very bottom, deemed too green to manage large tasks or too useful for intimate service. Frequently, they were placed in the direct service of the lady of the house, assisting with her wardrobe, bathing rituals, or childcare. However, fidelity brought no security. Compassion was rare. A single small error could result in immediate physical punishment or reassignment to a more difficult task. These young lives were denied the simple comfort of personal space. Their sleeping quarters were reduced to cold corners of the pantry, utility closets, or a cramped spot at the foot of their mistress's elaborate bed. They ate only after the elite family had finished, surviving on whatever meager scraps remained. Often, they were compelled to accompany their owners everywhere, to the public baths, to religious services, or to fashionable social gatherings, always mandated to be invisible, constantly vigilant, and profoundly subservient. Any learning provided was strictly utilitarian. A small, select group might receive training in needlework, musical performance, or perhaps basic herbal remedies, but only if the master calculated a financial return. Most girls were taught just enough Latin phonetics to respond to simple commands. Their original family names, native languages, and cultural practices were aggressively eradicated. They were actively programmed to forget who they were. This state of bondage was intended to be lifelong. Barring the rare event of being sold, severely disciplined, or formally released, a girl was permanently bound to that household. And unlike adult male slaves who were typically sent to construction sites or grueling farm labor, these female adolescents faced a unique and pervasive peril. Absolute visibility, making them vulnerable to exploitation that went far beyond domestic chores. Behind the majestic, expensive veneers of Roman life, these girls polished priceless silver that would never be theirs and nurtured the biological children of others. Their unacknowledged efforts directly enabled the famed luxury of the Roman high society, while their own individual lives slowly eroded, day by day, into unheralded, quiet suffering. In the celebrated brilliance of Roman affluence, any perceived defiance from an enslaved person, particularly a child, was met not with patience but with a horrifying severity backed by imperial law. The Roman family unit, or familia, acted as a condensed model of the empire itself. Rigid, deeply stratified, and unforgiving toward any challenge to hierarchy. For the captive girls, whose smallest mistake could be twisted into an act of rebellion, punishment was both a constant threat and the primary mechanism of control. The paterfamilias, recognized as the undisputed male head of the household, commanded the ancient legal right of vitae nascisque potestas, the power of life and death over all his dependents, including his human property. This immense authority was rarely questioned, and Roman statutes provided zero legal recourse for the enslaved. The philosopher Seneca once reflected, in his De Beneficiis, that we abuse our slaves as though they were not men, capturing the chilling banality of cruelty within privileged Roman homes. That a young serving girl could be brutally disciplined for a vast range of infractions: shattering a vessel, failing to attend quickly enough, interrupting a conversation, or showing hesitation in carrying out an order. The whip was the most common form of correction, its application so routine that Roman chroniclers mentioned it without special emphasis. Pliny the Younger wrote that some masters kept supervisors armed with lashes stationed throughout their estates simply to enforce perfect order. For the girls, these physical reprisals often occurred in secluded areas: laundry rooms, storehouses, or private gardens, where the shame intensified the agony. Publicized punishment served to terrorize the others. Enslaved girls might be shackled in prominent parts of the villa or compelled to perform excruciating, repetitive tasks as a direct message to fellow captives. The goal was total psychological subjugation, to embed the concept that resistance was futile. Certain owners, fearful of theft or flight, burned brands onto the foreheads or shoulders of their slaves with the letters FUG, fugitivis, marking them permanently as runaways. The Roman legal framework, embodied in the Lex Aelia Sentia, went so far as to permit the execution of slaves charged with plotting rebellion or physically striking their owner. While young girls were seldom executed, they lived under the crushing, permanent shadow of that ultimate threat. Punishment was never just about restoring order. It was a precise system engineered to break the spirit. Through calculated fear, Rome sustained its enormous machinery of servitude. And for the female children trapped within it, silence rapidly became their only viable strategy for survival. For the great majority of captured girls in ancient Rome, the dream of genuine freedom was nothing more than a faint, impossible whisper. Yet, for a truly exceptional handful, the formal process of manumission, legal release from bondage, offered a minute fracture of hope amidst lives otherwise dictated by ownership. Manumission, derived from the Latin terms for hand, manus, and to send forth, mittera, was the legal act of granting a slave their liberty. This could be achieved through various legal routes: a declaration before a public magistrate, inclusion in the master's last will, or a simple public statement witnessed by others. However, these legal avenues were nearly inaccessible to the enslaved young girls, who lacked personal status, lacked the financial means to purchase themselves, and lacked any advocate, unless the owner consented to the process. Freedom for young Ancilli was most often earned through lengthy and intensely personal service within the household. If a girl served loyally for many years, perhaps bore children fathered by the master, or became absolutely indispensable to the family's comfort, she might receive the reward of manumission much later in life. In some specific cases, particularly if she bore sons for the master, freedom was granted as a mechanism to legitimize the lineage or to ensure continued loyalty and property protection. Once released, these women were known as liberty freedwomen. But this freedom was heavily conditional. Roman statutes demanded that they continue to honor their former owners, now designated as patroni, patrons. They were legally obligated to provide lifelong loyalty, continued labor, and often a portion of their income. A freed woman could not cut ties completely. Her new identity remained inextricably linked to the very family that had once enslaved her. In a final act of erasure, she frequently adopted the family's name, burying her original identity forever. A few freed women managed to carve out modest lives. They established marriages, operated small-scale businesses, or successfully raised children born free. Tomb inscriptions discovered throughout Rome occasionally bear witness to these rare success stories. Former slaves who managed to secure a measure of dignity in their liberty. This is the hidden history that fuels our understanding of the Roman Empire. We want to hear what you think. Let us know in the comments below. What does the normalization of this suffering reveal about the civilizing mission of Rome? But these stories of success were always outliers. For the vast, overwhelming majority, manumission was a dream that died with them. A slave's chances were almost entirely dictated by their age, sex, and role. And for young girls at the absolute bottom of Rome's social pyramid, freedom was a rare, easily retracted gift, too often indefinitely deferred. The empire extended it not as a basic right, but as a hard-won prize, earned only through decades of compliant obedience, utter silence, and pure endurance. Rome proudly proclaimed itself the pinnacle of civilization, but in its dark corners, countless girls were stripped bare of their identity, their liberty, and their future. The empire's vaunted power was engraved not only into granite and gold, but into the living flesh and shattered lives of the utterly voiceless. Their agonizing silence ultimately shaped Rome, and the echoes of their erased history demand our attention today. As the ancient Roman playwright Plautus wrote, describing the brutal clarity of a slave's world, "Man is a wolf to man, not a man, when he doesn't know what the other is like." If this deep dive into Roman history opened your eyes, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next untold story.